Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Developing Solutions, a series that's only 18 months behind schedule, which is bad even by my standards. We're going to kick off this series by talking about Kodak Polydol, an obsolete, discontinued developer. So Polydol has been discontinued for decades. The most recent technical information I could find on it was from the early 70s. I can't tell you exactly when it was discontinued, but I've never seen it in anything but a can, and I'm certain that Kodak was not canning their chemicals by the late 1980s, because I remember being in a darkroom in the late 1980s and everything was in a bag. Here is what Kodak said of Polydol in their 1970 technical publication. For commercial and portrait work, has exceptionally high capacity with consistent activity when replenished. Recommended for use with Kodak Portrait Panchromatic, Super Speed Ortho Portrait, Panatomic X, Super X XX Pan, RS Pan, Super Panchro-Press, Royal Pan, Tri-X, Ortho, Plus X Pan, and Tri-X Pan sheet films. Are any of those films still in production? Maybe the Tri-X Pan, but the 320 ISO, but I can't even promise that it's in any way, shape, or form the same thing as it was 60 years ago. Polydol was particularly popular with commercial developers and schools because of what Kodak states in their 1962 tech pub. Kodak Polydol Developer has many lives, so many that we place no limits on its use. Properly replenished, you keep on using and using Kodak Polydol, and the negatives keep on developing and developing, as though your developer were forever fresh. All right, here's the best tip I'm going to have for you. Kodak Polydol was discontinued so long ago that if developer times and concentrations for it are available, I've never found them, and certainly there is likely to only be one film stock still around today that was around when this stuff was made, and that's Kodak Tri-X 320. So if you get your hands on Polydol, which it's worth doing, if you find a can of Polydol, it's shelf stable, you can still use it. Just use the developing times for microdol X and the concentrations as well. And it stands to reason, of course, that Polydol would work with the microdol X developing times, as they are chemically identical, except that Polydol adds less than 1% dry weight volume of sodium citrate tribasic to the microdol X formula. So functionally, they are identical chemistries, and the microdol X times work very well with Polydol. That's what I go to anytime I use Polydol for development. I think that what the sodium citrate does is that it's a very slight pH balancing agent, but that it also works as a buffer to prevent negatives from coming out too thin, which makes it a slightly more forgiving film developer than is microdol X, which does have a bit of a learning curve. According to the Kodak Chemical Technical Reference datasheets, Polydol has a full stoppered bottle stock solution shelf life of 6 months. A half-full stoppered bottle stock solution should last 2 months. In personal experience, I've had it last way longer than that, like a year when stoppered and half full. Tray developing of the working solution, what you take from the stock solution to make into the working solution, is 24 hours. If you use it in a 1-gallon tank, this is again the working solution, it can be expected to last up to 1 month. So it has some good shelf life and some good working solution time, and what that means for the working solution is you can keep reusing the same working solution until your images start looking a little bit thinner, or for tray developers like me, your tray developing times start getting longer than they were when you began using that working solution. And the last note in this section, my personally preferred concentration for Polydol when tank developing it, meaning a daylight tank, is 1+3. When I tray develop Polydol, I will go 1+5, 1+9, 1+10, depending on what I'm developing, to give myself a slower development time and more a flatter image so that I can control the contrast more in post. What does that mean? Well, let's talk about how to mix Polydol. So right off the bat, I did a few things not perfectly here. I did use 100 degree Fahrenheit water, which I'm supposed to, but I did not pour the powder into a full gallon of it, poured it into a partial gallon, then I mixed it up and topped it off. The directions say, to prepare, open the can and pour the chemical slowly with sufficient agitation to keep the chemical suspended into 1 US gallon, which is 3.8 liters of water at 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 38 degrees Celsius. Stir until the chemical is dissolved completely and uniform in the solution. I don't have a stirrer I can put into a gallon jug like this, so I just shake it up. Net result's the same. But do be very careful with chemicals and always follow the proper order of operation to avoid unexpected chemical reactions. While unlikely with film chemistry, it's not impossible. For this section, we're going to take a look at a single shot analyzed 3 different ways. And here is that shot. How did I do this? I took a whole bunch of Arista 100, put it into a 4x5 camera, shot the exact same scene, same lens, same focus point, same aperture and shutter speed. Over the course of this video series, we're going to have a really nice database of these comparison shots. Before developing it, I cut that 4x5 sheet into 3 strips, developed 1 in Polydol stock, 1 in Polydol 1+1, and 1 in Polydol 1+3. You can see that above the top there. There's also going to be a link in the video's description where you can see these comparison shots, and you can, as this series develops, compare the different photos or the same photos across different developers. So here's his first shot. And one thing I want to impress upon you is that the negative density on all 3 of these strips was functionally identical. They're really, with what I can do, there would have been no way for me to get it more perfect than it was. But as you can see, there are still some interesting differences in this test shot, especially when it comes to the amount of contrast in the skies and the shadow retention in the foreground. So let's go to our first up-close shot. This is a 100% crop of a middle stretch of the whole shot, right? And basically, what we're seeing here is a closer version of the sky in the foreground in 1. And it starts to become a little bit more apparent that the Polydol 1+1 does a really good job of adding contrast in what was an overcast day. You can really make out some nice cloud details. The stock, it's hard to see through the pine tree needles, but that pretty much gets lost. The 1+3, you have some of it, but it's a hair muddier. That also, as you might be able to see in the trees here, translates into the shadows in the foreground, specifically with the way that the trees have detail or not in the shadows. 1+3 is pretty muddy. 1+1's looking pretty good. Our second compare shot goes in even closer. I guess maybe this is actually 100% crop. But anyway, some things I noticed looking at this 100% crop area of 3 different similar sections of sky. The stock developer has an apparently higher grain, which is 1, and 1+3 has the least grain. For reference, stock was developed at 8 minutes, 1+1 at 10, 1+3 at 14. I had no idea what to use for 1+3 because I could not find any reference data, so I guessed. And it worked out really well. Going on, 1+1 has the best contrast in the sky, as we noticed, and I think that really shows in this crop. It's not shown well in this shot, but we'll see it in just a minute. 1+1 has the best dark tones, and what I mean by that is shadow retention, and the overall density across all of the negatives appeared to be as close to identical as I could hope for. Our third comparison shot takes a 100% crop of the foreground here, and is similar in area of the foreground as I could manage. So, of note here, the stock grain adds a very nice texture to the rocks. The 1+3 image, however, looks almost too smooth in the foreground. Stock seems to have the best overall contrast in the foreground, and the 1+1 is a near tie for second place. The stock has better contrast, but the 1+1 has better shadow retention in the trees. The 1+1 has the best detail in the shadows, and the 1+3 is a bit muddy in the shadows. So overall, what this shows us is that the developer does deliver consistent density across all 3 of these standard concentrations. It also delivers different levels of grain, shadow retention, contrast, and things like that in different parts of the image as it relates to how the scene was lit during the test photo being taken. So ultimately, I think a pretty interesting result that shows the way that this developer could be used beneficially for different types of lighting conditions, with even lighting being better for stock developing, higher contrast lighting being better for 1+1, and flatter lighting if you want to use contrast enhancement in your enlarger being best at 1+3. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next Developing Solutions.